pleasure to have Annette with us in Germany. We had several events with her discussing with parliamentarians, politicians, peace activists about a very highly interesting region, which is also a region of conflicts and wars, and a region with a high risk of even a bigger war. And I only would like to mention at the beginning 3 words, and Annette is much more important to explain the words. I would like to mention the word AUKUS, the coalition between Great Britain, US, and Australia. We'd like to mention the exercises of mainly the United States with their allies in the Pacific, RAMPAC. And I would like to have to mention the Taiwan conflict, however you are calling the conflict, which is a huge dynamic for a very dangerous situation. You know, you could read in the newspapers today that there are new maneuvers around the island, that there is a new president, which is very provocative, starts his new period. There are the reactions of the 2 opposition parties, which want to ban him a little bit and control him a little bit. So a lot of controversies. You have an arms race, which is in the same way big like the arms race in Europe. And we have the combination between Asia and Europe on one side in the arms race, but also the other side of new coalition building. And BRICS is one of these coalitions, which brings together main countries of the global south in Asia with one big European country. And I think we have a lot of things to discuss, to be informed about the region for me, who is a key player for the changes in the world for the next years. Without Asia, peace is not possible. Without Asia, development is not possible. I think without Asia, also the solving of the climate problem is not possible. So it is an unknown region for us. And Australia, as the 5th continent, is always forgotten. You know, for us, Australia is quite new in our minds. So, you know, we are speaking about Asia and Europe, but Australia as a continent. You know, I only knew about the continent because we had an intern in IPB who was coming from Australia. So she told us about the continent and the country. And so we learned a little bit, but Annette, the floor is to you. You are working and engaged in the Independent and Peaceful Australian Network, IPEN, and the floor is to you to tell us more about the 5th continent, the relation of the 5th continent to Asia, to Europe, to the United States. I think we have many, many interesting points. You have the floor, and afterwards we will share our Q and answers, and then hopefully we'll have a productive discussion. And the floor is to you. It's great that you could come to Germany. I think for us it was a great pleasure, and I think we learned a lot from you. The floor is to you.
Well, thank you very much, Rainer, and the team here in Berlin for the IPB. It's a great pleasure to be here and to have an opportunity to learn from you and to share some information from Australia. So I'm the chair of the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, and it is a network of representatives from around the country. We have 2 formal representatives on the coordinating committee from each state, so that's 16. Plus we have a sort of an extra layer of people who are working in specific areas on working groups, which I'll talk a little bit about through the talk. So I've had a great time so far just being shown around Berlin and learning more. So, I mean, our first contact with the International Peace Bureau would have been at the beginning of the campaign around GADAMS, as it was at the time. And the Brisbane group that I chaired at the time, which is called Just Peace Queensland, that formed not long after 9/11, that was the impetus, really, the stimulus to form a group in Brisbane around the time. And we had a very heady period for about 5 years after 9/11. So that particular group every year engages on the GCOMs now. And only just a few weeks ago, we decided as part of that, for our day's activity, we would hand out white poppies for peace, which one of our members crochets. I know she has done thousands of these white poppies. She does them on the train when she's travelling. And we handed out 600 to students going into the Central High School in Brisbane. We had a big police presence turned up. Just these very, very innocuous people handing out white hoppers, but the children and the teachers that went through were all very interested. They come with a little card that talks about military spending. So it's a great way to communicate with everyday people, in this case, high school students, about the matters to do with military spending. So IPAN, or the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, came into being when the Pacific Pivot was announced by Obama in 2011. Obama was invited to Australia. He gave an address in the Parliament, and he announced, with the consent of the Australian government, that we would host a rotational number of US Marines in Darwin. So that was certainly a flashcard for us. Never before, outside of wartime, has Australia ever hosted a foreign country's military forces. So this was what happened in 2011, and we started networking around the country, and we had our first conference in 2014 in Canberra. So the big issues for the Australian people and the peace movement really in Australia are our relations with China and US preparations for war being orchestrated through AUKUS, a force posture agreement. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Economic integration, media integration, and working within our educational institutions. I'll talk a little bit more about those later. And relations with China were really, really on a knife edge under the previous government. It was a Conservative government, and we had upset China with some of the claims that we had made around the virus, around COVID, and hence we ended up with a lot of sanctions on trade goods, which really was a huge impact because it affected agricultural areas of trade and set them back quite considerably. But with the election of the Labor government in 2022, they have gone out of their way to re-establish good diplomatic relations with China. And we are, in fact, expecting a visit to Australia by Xi Jinping later on this year. So he will address the Parliament. It's interesting to note that Xi Jinping has previously addressed our Parliament at the time when we had good relations, and we were making lots of money with that trade with China. So everyone in Australia was really happy to have Xi Jinping come to Australia. And, you know, people have put a certain timeline on when things started to go sour, and it was a deliberate souring, orchestrated to demonise China. And I think it happened around about 6 years ago, and then it went downhill really, really over that period of time. So AUKUS, this agreement brings together the UK, the United States and Australia in an informal agreement. There's nothing signed with this AUKUS pact. It's not an alliance, it's an agreement. I'm sure there's various financial and economic legal agreements in amongst it all, but between the countries, there's nothing formally to sign. It's divided into two areas, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Pillar 1 relates to the acquisition of 8 nuclear-powered submarines at a cost to the Australian public of $368 billion. It is over 30 years, it's still a hell of a lot of money. It works out to, we did the calculations, it's something like $1 million a day for 100 years, or something along those lines. It's just an absurd amount of money. The AUKUS deal was worked on by the previous Prime Minister, and he did it in secret, basically. Right up towards the end of their last term, the announcement was made that Australia was going to cancel the contract we had with France to build 6 submarines. They weren't nuclear-powered diesel submarines, So it was well along the way. We had workers in France working on the construction, and in cancelling that submarine deal, it has cost the Australian government, what did I read today, $5 billion to get out of the contract. So the second pillar involves development of technology for war. And this second pillar involves undersea capabilities, robotic systems, etc., quantum technologies, with the partners aiming to deliver generation after next quantum capabilities. And it's worth just another little current or recent information that was revealed in the last budget by the government is that we've set aside $1 billion to an Australian company that's working on a quantum computer. It'll be a first in the world, apparently. This is where they want to put it. And you can bet your bottom dollar there's a military tag on that as well. AI and autonomy, they're using these technologies to improve the speed and precision of decision-making processes and defend against AI-enabled threats. And in this sphere, the initial focus is on adoption and resilience of autonomous and AI-enabled systems in contested environments. Read South China Sea. Advanced cyber capabilities, particularly to protect critical communications, but it's also been talked about as part of war fighting, so using cyber on other countries. Innovation, where partners aim to achieve by accelerating defence innovation, learning from each other, and information sharing, particularly to enable other Pillar 2 work streams by expanding and accelerating the sharing of sensitive information. I was just reading something about that today from KJ No, the American researcher. Yeah, he was talking about just that very thing. The economic impact of arming up for war is huge, just as I said, and the current defence budget announced this month of $55 billion just for the defence budget this year, or 2.1% of GDP, and it's up by 6%, and it's projected to be $100 billion a year by 2033, or 2.4% of GDP. So public questioning mostly centres on the cost of the submarines. I don't think the broader community knows much about Pillar 2, but it's very, very much in people's thinking, and there's fairly constant media references in one way or another to the submarines. So from our perspective, trying to raise awareness and engage people, it's probably, the tag that we need to use most effectively. The polls also show the Lowy Institute does an annual poll, and that polling does show that still the vast majority of people are saying they do not want Australia to get involved in a war over Taiwan. 80% of the Australian people said they didn't want to go to war in Iraq. They just took no notice. If you've got the two major parties on the same track, forget about public opinion. They'll just do it anyway. So unfortunately, that's the reality. So I just thought I'd go through some details of the war preparations that have been advanced by a signed deal called the Force Posture Agreement. Now, this document was signed very quietly again. Most people didn't really know anything about it. In fact, it was one of our members doing his own research that found it, and is now being shared widely with politicians, and it gets a lot of airplay now. But the Force Posture Agreement, they're signed in other countries as well. I know Philippines has just recently signed another one. Papua New Guinea has just signed a Force Posture Agreement. But this one was signed in 2014, and it included the stationing of those Marines in Darwin, up to 2,500 a year. That's been reached now. They gradually increased that over time. They are trained and equipped for immediate deployment. Many of them come from Guam for that 6-month period. So they're very battle ready, and they train with the Australian Defence Forces. It provides access to Australia's airfields and airport facilities for US fighter planes and bombers. It provides unimpeded access for the United States forces and contractors, and use of agreed areas and facilities for training, transit, support and related activities, refuelling of aircraft, bunkering of vessels, temporary maintenance of vehicles, vessels and aircraft, temporary accommodation, of personnel, communications, pre-positioning of equipment, supplies and materials, deploying forces and materials, and such other activities as the parties may agree. It's really, you know, all the way with USA. It provides access to Australia's airfields and airport facilities for US fighter planes and bombers. And the agreement states that the United States forces and its contractors shall have unimpeded access to agreed facilities and areas for all matters relating to the pre-positioning and storage of defence equipment and supplies, including delivery, management, inspection, use, maintenance, da-da-da. In short, the agreement enables the United States not only to station its troops in Darwin, but to store munitions, etc., on Australian soil, war supplies, etc. So some of you will probably know about the Red Hill disaster in Hawaii with the fuel tanks. They're contaminating the ground water, and those fuel tanks are very old. Well, virtually what is the plan, and it's happening, it's happened, in fact, is that aircraft fuel to have on hand in the event of a war is now in 7 massive tanks on the edge of Darwin. So it's on East Arm is the place in Darwin that they built these tanks very quickly, and that's yet another indication. The agreement makes Australia a base in the Indo-Pacific, Southeast Asia for the US military, from which they can launch hostile acts against our neighbours. And currently they have their sights on islands claimed by China in the South China Sea, and some commentators have said they have their sights on blocking the Straits of Malacca in order to put pressure on China by blocking its major shipping routes. Most of the public narrative is we need to be there to protect our shipping routes, but it makes no sense. That is where China exports, you know, with using shipping through those straits, and that, you know, I mean, it's pretty obvious, really. So this force posture agreement lasts, it's set for 25 years, but it can be terminated by either party giving 1 year's notice. So that's our aim, really, is to get to a point where that is terminated. So while the force posture agreement comprises the most all-embracing and comprehensive US military installations as a base for its operations, the process started long ago in the 1960s with the US establishing the Northwest Cape Submarine Communications Base and then Pine Gap. Do people know about, I'm sure you all know about Pine Gap. It's a satellite tracking station. It's used to monitor, but it's also used to provide information. And from what our expert in Australia, Richard Tanter, says, it is probably being used to help Israel target sites in Gaza for bombing. So it's a highly sophisticated satellite tracking station in the middle of Australia. We held a protest there in 2016. So as a network of organisations, we believe the American century is well and truly over, and it is time to forge new associations and to think not in terms of military alliances, but rather in terms of alliances built on peaceful relations. Our subservience to the United States does us no good in the eyes of growing powers like China, India, Brazil, and you could probably add quite a lot of other countries to that list as well. Just a little bit more on the Marines in Darwin. It's a fully equipped Marine air-ground task force designed for rapid force projection in times of conflict and capable of taking and holding strategic territory in anticipation of more substantial forces surging through. The island chain strategy of the United States, this is part of that island chain strategy where they'll have forces available in Australia, in Philippines, in Guam, into Jeju and Okinawa. So this is being talked about a lot. Darwin was chosen as its location offers close proximity to the Straits of Malacca, the world's busiest corridor through which 80% of China's crude oil imports pass. And it's also, the fact is that it is outside of most missile threat ranges emanating from China. This was at the time anyway. It has low traffic skies for aerial training and sits astride a huge, sparsely populated interior region of land that every year opens to live fire simulations. This is Aboriginal land. And again, we've had various US leaders come sort of salivating, saying how good this is. We haven't got anything like this. None of this space, this open land, this unoccupied land. But, this is so typical of the attitude towards Aboriginal land. It's important in the event of a conflict, as it calls to question Australia's own freedom of action should a conflict break out. But there's quite a lot of talk about, our alliance and AUKUS and the FPA basically locking us into in being involved in a conflict that the US instigates. And they've recently, again quietly, it was only found out by the Australian Broadcasting Commission that in reading papers from America, this happens a lot actually. We find out information about deals that have been done by looking at the documents from America, and so we found out that they're going to establish, or have already established, what they call a Squadron Operations Facility in Darwin. It's a US command centre, so we've been staffed by the United States military to operate from Darwin. So it's big, really, what's happening in our country. So establishing a more independent foreign policy and disentangling Australia and American national interests was a cause that one of our former prime ministers, a conservative prime minister who, when he was out of office, became very progressive, Malcolm Fraser, and he wrote a book not long before he died called Our Dangerous Enemy, which he said it's our greatest threat to our security comes from the United States. So that's pretty amazing coming from a former conservative government prime minister. So following Obama's pivot to an Asia announcement, we had that response from groups around Australia, and that's when we got together and formed the national network aimed at building a movement and campaign for an independent foreign policy and opposition to US Marines and bases in Australia. The network's name and objectives were finalised mid-2012, and IPAN was officially launched nationally on the International Day of Peace 2012. And following that, we had a succession of meetings with unions and various peace groups, and had our first conference in Canberra in 2014. So At the conference, we reinforced that we advocate for an independent and peaceful Australia, free of foreign military bases and free of interventions by foreign governments, corporations, and vested interests that at present seek to exert undue influence in shaping Australia's foreign and defence policies in a manner that diminishes our sovereignty, and B, that we recognise that a truly peaceful and independent Australia cannot be achieved without resolving the cruel and unjust takeover of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander lands, and in our activities to work to address these injustices, which began under British law and have continued under Australian governments since Federation. And it should be noted that this mission statement does not simply address US interference, but interference from any country, China or Russia included. So since that first conference, just some of the work that we've done and the achievements. Is that okay if I just talk about that?
Please.
Yeah. What has developed since that time, rather than our achievements, is that Darwin now has the full complement of 2,500 Marines. But there's a lot more going on there. There's more than that. They've built housing for ongoing US personnel in Darwin. Been a controversy in Darwin about that because it was on the lands of a threatened bird species. So the environmental group in Darwin has got on board opposing that. Not particularly successful. We've also seen a decision to transfer 800 Australian Defence Force personnel from Adelaide to be based in Darwin, and that is the ambition is for them to train in literal activities, i.e., landing on shores in the event of an invasion of another country. The Tyndall Air Base at Katherine in the Northern Territory has been upgraded to with housing for B-52 bombers. B-52 bombers are capable of carrying nuclear weapons. The government keeps reinforcing that we will not have any nuclear weapons on Australian territory, but they also accept that they have stated that we accept the United States prerogative to neither confirm nor deny whether they have nuclear weapons on board. It's one of the big things that we've had a problem with, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. ICAN in Australia believes it's still possible to kind of find ways to get the Australian government to sign on. It was a commitment of the Prime Minister when they were out of office. There's still pressure on Australia to get them to sign the TPNW. But, you know, with this caveat that, you know, they will neither confirm nor deny, I just don't see how we can stick with the legality of the treaty. The other thing that's been looked at over the last year is establishing another Air Force base in the far north of Queensland. It's a very tiny RAF base at Sherga, but they're looking at expanding that too. So it's right up on the Cape. Also, the Cocos Islands. Have you heard anything about that, Stephanie? Cocos Islands are a long way from Australia, but they were sort of privately owned, a lot of islands, and they came under Australia's control in the last 30, 40 years. And they have now moved the people that were living on one side of the island to the other, and they've put in a big airstrip. So it's quite strategic for an attack on China, the Cocos Islands. The Stirling Naval Base off the coast of Perth, which is now being upgraded, again at a cost to the Australian purse of $8 billion. It's being upgraded so that we can start to receive US and UK nuclear-powered, probably nuclear-armed submarines to be stationed there as they come down into this part of the world. So the story from the Australian government is this is about preparing this naval base for Australian nuclear submarines, but they won't eventuate for a long time. In the meantime, we'll have, and we are having, those other countries' submarines travel through. So there is also a new Army brigade that's being established in Adelaide to focus on long-range precision weapons, including the HIMARS. So, you know, there's it's a constant march really to prepare Australia further. So we have, as I said, we have a coordinating committee of eight from the 8 states, and we meet every 2 months for a coordinating committee meeting, but every second month we have a general meeting, which we invite our members to attend, and we'll have a speaker attend those meetings. Our last meeting last month, we had a young Palestine activist from Melbourne who talked to us about the work that they're doing in Melbourne. So it's a good way to, you know, encourage membership to turn up if we've got an interesting speaker as well. So the working groups that we have established include one on an alternative defence policy. So, you know, we really do have a strong conviction that it's important that we're advocating for change and being clear about what sort of change we want, rather than being an oppositional group only. So we do obviously work in oppositional ways, particularly around AUKUS, with various rallies and events that we organise and encourage the broader community to come along. But this working group has spent a lot of time detailing how we might have a different foreign policy, a different defence policy, one that is really all about defence, not an offence force tied to the United States. So that group has been working with politicians, former military people, where there's quite a number of people who have left the military. We have a really great young man in Brisbane who was in the ADF for 20 years and had a bit of an awakening. He's very articulate and he often speaks at rallies, and he's also working in that working group. So we do have an anti-AUKUS group, which is a national group, and that group is more focused on organising rallies and public speaking events. The Force Posture group is you know, working on ways in which to raise awareness that this exists and just what it has meant for our sovereignty as a country. There's a lot of work to be done on that. The Pacific Peace Network, which was instigated coming out of the IPAN conference in Darwin in 2019. Really, it does go back to the anti-NATO conference that I attended in Dublin in 2018, where we had a number of Pacific people attending that conference. And that's the benefit of a conference, isn't it? The face-to-face and getting to know people on a personal level. And a number of us there thought, really, we need to start something up. So that's how it's developed. And yes, the Pacific Peace Network really has, in terms of capacity, we have just focused on the 2 major Pacific military exercises that are run by the United States with the support of other countries. So RIMPAC is the big military exercise in Hawaii, and that happens every 2 years. Hawaii has a very wonderful, active peace organisation who we work with there. And this year they will be having events in July and August. It also coincided with a Pacific festival, arts festival. They're very creative. A lot of the people in the Hawaiian group are very artistic and creative, and they do some wonderful things. And the alternate year, this big military exercise happens in Queensland, in my home state, and it's Talisman Sabre, and there's a similar number of countries and personnel involved, around about 25,000 people, military personnel turn up, and they run mock attacks in all parts of the country. So, we always work on various awareness raising campaigns around both those exercises. In 2009, we had a massive one. We're still sort of in the kind of the ripples of people's consciousness about Iraq. By 2009, it was all starting to die down. Really, people are starting to put that in the past and not think about it, despite the fact that everything that was going on in Syria and Iraq was a result of the Iraq war. It had all shifted, but we had a huge sort of convention, really, while Talisman Sabre was going on, with about 1,000 people there, and it was great. But we couldn't do that right now. The consciousness isn't there at the moment. So we'll continue to work with trying to expand the Pacific Peace Network. We don't have any representation much from the South Pacific, like Fiji and Tahiti, New Caledonia. So there's real work needs to be done, and that's something that we're discussing within the organising group of that Pacific Peace Network. Another area that we have a working group on is on transparency and accountability, the whole secrecy that goes on in government, trying to expose deals and plans that are being done in secret. And we've now got a group of academics and former government people and former military people working. I've called the group the Peace and Security Think Tank. So we're hoping that it can be quite an influential think tank in Australia. So the other area is utilising this IPAN inquiry report. The inquiry we worked on in 2022, and it was a huge task. The main reason and goal that we wanted to come out of the inquiry process was, again, an opportunity to get outside of the bubble of people who already had good understandings, to be able to engage with people in the community, in trade unions, in religious groups, and so on. And we figure we did reach around about 10,000 people in the process. We also brought on board 8 community leaders, lawyers, trade union leaders, and faith leaders to be involved in receiving the submissions. 300 submissions came from across Australia, and so we've got very close relationships now with those 8 community leaders, and that has strengthened our leadership and our network by that process. We released the report in Parliament, so it was tabled in the Parliament, and we also had a public launch of the inquiry in the National Parliament. Working with the Greens, David Shoebridge, the Greens leader on defence in Australia. He's a very, very decent and committed person. So I won't talk for too much longer now, but just very quickly, the achievements I think that we've made over the last, well, I suppose it's 12 years now, that we've established our structure, our identity, and we've got, I would think that we have a great deal of respect in the community. We send out regular monthly newsletters to about 1,000 people. We've maintained and built on the initial membership, so somewhere between 50 and 60 organisations are members of the network, and around about 200 individuals. Initially, we didn't set the network up to have individuals join, but then we started getting people who wanted to join that weren't in an organisation. So, you know, we welcome that as well. So IPAN's public campaigning, we consider, has raising the issues, has led to these issues being taken up more widely by more prominent people. Just one example is an academic works for the Lowy Institute, and now I'm going to forget his name, but he's written a book called the Echidna Project, and what he has, the content of that book is essentially an alternative defence policy, and the echidna has lots of spiky spines like hedgehogs do, and his the thrust of the book really is that Australia should have plenty of defence around its northern coastline, be ready to put the spines up to deter any invasion or anything, but to stay away from projected force, which is the term that they use a lot in qualifying the amount of money and work that's going into the upgrade. So we've also played a significant role in the growth of widespread opposition to AUKUS, particularly the massive expenditure on nuclear submarines. The People's Inquiry I've talked about, establishing good relations with various political representatives, not just the Greens. There are people, independents, as well as a few people in the Labor Party, and even a couple of people in the Conservatives that are interested in the issues and the problems that I've raised. Good relations with, and growing relations, I should say, with journalists in the media camp in Australia. That's something that we're working on and we see as really important to develop those personal one-to-one relations with key journalists that are working on foreign affairs and international relations. The regular conferences, which we hold every 2 years, and the next one coming up, it will be in Perth in Western Australia. Decided on that particular location because of the upgrade of Stirling Naval Base, the issues around nuclear waste. As part of the the AUKUS agreement, Australia has, you know, unbelievably, stupidly and irresponsibly agreed to accept the nuclear waste from submarines, not just the ones that we're going to get, but all United States and all United Kingdom nuclear reactors. So that would come to Australia, and it will be stored, as far as the agreement goes, on Australian Defence Force land. But that's the whole of the country. You know, this is Aboriginal land, and there's been a very long and effective process where Aboriginal people have denied even the storage of low-level waste from the only reactor we have in Australia, which is in Sydney. It's a reactor that is used for medical isotopes and that sort of thing. So they actually store all their waste in barrels outside of the reactor, and they've been looking for a repository of that waste for a very long time, but they wanted to create a waste dump in South Australia on Aboriginal land, and that Aboriginal people just resisted. So it's, you know, this is another opportunity for us to establish closer and working relationships with Aboriginal people in Western Australia. The environmental groups in Western Australia are also coming on board with helping us to organise this conference, which is great. And, you know, I think it'll be a really important conference for us to hold. We would aim to have closer relationships with environment groups, and I know Emily and I talked a bit about that yesterday. It's not an easy relationship to crack, because, you know, the focus amongst young people working on environmental issues, understandably, is the crisis of climate change and how much of a crisis it is, and much effort is going into trying to, to change policies around that. So that's a big one. Longer term, I think we have the same problem as every organisation does, is renewal, getting younger people into the organisation, and deliberately setting out to that as part of our work to bring on younger people into IPAN, into the core group, because the core group is really where, as you know, with IPB, that's where a lot of the leadership and the direction comes from, and we need younger voices. We have started to see people from, we've got a slightly better spread of ages now than we did, and I think we've realised that we just need to continue to do that. We also aim to play a role in working with international organisations, and that's why we value working with the IPB. We value working with World Beyond War, and we also work with, to one degree or another, United Nations associations in Australia. I'm also a Vice President of the United Nations Association in Queensland. So we've got quite a good relationship with those people that work on UN issues, particularly in Queensland. So I think that's about enough for me to say. I probably said too much, but very, very happy to have had the opportunity to share that information, and I'd be really appreciate if you've got any questions or you'd like to, kind of talk about any of the issues that I've brought up.
Thank you so much, Annette. I think I've taken 5 or 6 pages of notes here from everything, and even with everything I knew before, there was so much more to add to it, and so I think you talked the right amounts, but I could also listen to you for another hour talking about it for sure. But it is very comprehensive and covers a lot of points here. My job is to moderate now a Q&A if there are questions in the room or online. If you are joining us online and you would like to ask a question, you should be able to do so through the chat box or the raise hand function you should be able to find on your screen. If I don't see any questions, I have a few of my own for sure, perhaps as a start. But yes, I see one over here, so please go ahead.
I'm sorry, I came a little bit late, but you might have told around already what was the original event that triggered your initiation? That you started apparently in 2012. What was politically the thing that made you think we have to step in here and we have to do something?
Yeah, I did talk about that before you came, and it was the Pacific Pivot announced by President Obama at the time, and the decision to host United States Marines on Australian territory.
Thank you. And if you have any more questions, please feel free. Even if we may have talked about it earlier, that's okay. I see Raina would like to ask a question though.
I mean, my question goes to the geostrategic competition in the region. We see these fight between the United States and China, and what are the people in your country thinking about it? Are there new coalition buildings, which I would call people's diplomacy, of the different countries which are engaged in this competition fight? It's not only China, the US, but also all the islands. So this means, are you working together with peace groups in New Zealand, for example, or on the Pacific Islands, which are playing more and more key role in the Philippines, but maybe even do have relations to groups in Taiwan? So this is, and my question is a little bit to your international relations, when you have some, or when you're doing something in this field.
Yeah, definitely. Raina, I agree that's really important, and we certainly have done some of that with the Pacific Peace Network. Last July, while the Talisman Sabre exercise was on, we had a Pacific Peace Conference in Brisbane, in my hometown, and we had representatives from Okinawa, from Guam, and also from New Zealand. New Zealand is interesting. They've just recently had an election of a very conservative new government. The Conservative new government has reiterated that they will maintain the nuclear-free waters around New Zealand. They have signed the TPNW when Jacinda Ardern was the Prime Minister. Very quickly, like within months, they signed and ratified the TPNW. So I had a lot of time for Jacinda Ardern. And the new government is not talking about doing away with that, but it has expressed interest in joining Pillar 2, which is all the technology and cyber and so on. So it does lock them in on another level. At the conference, we had a wonderful young woman, a Maori woman, come to speak, Rana Arata, her name was. And they, in New Zealand, she had just been on a national tour, tiny little New Zealand, but it's 2 islands. So doing a national tour is still a big thing, with a group of people to talk about AUKUS and why New Zealand should stay out of AUKUS. So that's a really good, connection and relationship to have. And certainly with Okinawa and Guam, quite a number of our conferences, we have had representatives from Guam, Lisa Natividad. Our last one was Nick Flores, very dynamic young woman. Nick, she's definitely worth knowing about if you ever want to invite someone to come to a conference from Guam. She's great. So yeah, no, I think there's a lot more work to be done in that area, and we're aiming to have representation from Pacific people at the conference in October this year.
Do you have contacts to China?
No, we don't. So it would be great to have someone from China. Yeah.
You may have some ideas on that for sure. I think there is a question online here as well, and maybe I will add my own question as well because I don't want to miss out the opportunity. But first I'll read the question online here, and then perhaps you can answer both questions as you see fit. So the first one is, putting all together, how much time do you think we have to change politics before a third world war concerning resources will start? I see. Okay, we have another question coming in. How can we deploy worldwide initiatives to build up peace? Greetings from Latin America. This is from our colleague Pedro Paez.
Wonderful.
And to add to that, mine relates quite a bit to Pedro's question here, which is, of course, here in Europe, what role can we play also in supporting the activists in Australia? I think, there are certain countries where there's a sort of natural alliance, whether it be with the Pacific countries that all are sharing similar experiences of having US military bases, or the US, where there could be a campaign, for example, alongside, or US-UK against AUKUS, there could perhaps be a campaign. But here in Europe, we maybe also are not so independent from the US, and I'm wondering how you could see perhaps solidarity actions or some activities that we can do here in Germany that might support the work that IPAN is doing.
Thanks, Sean. Well, I'll answer the last one because that's the one that's most in my memory. Look, I think the global NATO issue is probably the big one that we can seek input and collaboration on from people in the European peace movement. For those that don't know, the overtures are with Japan, and particularly Japan and South Korea, for NATO to expand into those countries, and for there to be an office of NATO, I think, in Japan.
Tokyo.
Yeah. So Australia has been very nicely presented with a special relationship with NATO. In 2014, our foreign minister went to a conference of NATO in Wales, and we were conferred with a special partnership status. So now anything to do with NATO, anything that that's happening with NATO in Europe, our defence minister is on the plane straight away. Our defence minister, Richard Marles, is on the very far right end of the spectrum in the Labor Party, and you know, he's causes a lot of angst for anyone who's a bit progressive in Australia with his position on the relationship with the United States, but also with NATO. So yeah, like I think there's opportunities there. And when I was talking to Seven the other day, you know, there is this real interest in just how NATO is now seeing itself as having a role to play in the Pacific as well as in the North Atlantic. Yeah. So in terms of the time frame before the Third World War, let's hope it doesn't happen at all. And that's what we're all doing, putting so much time and effort into trying to prevent that happening. But anyone who reads international affairs and what's happening in the build-up in Australia indicates that this is what their intention is. At least a portion of the United States establishment, a crazy portion, actually thinks it's okay to do this. I think it's probably mixed within the US military and political establishment as to whether there would be agreement to go ahead with a military attack on China or provoking an incident that gives them an excuse to step in militarily. But everything I read, you know, the hawks in the United States are all talking about 2025, 2026. I mean, this is next year. I mean, this is horrible, horrible stuff to think about. So, you know, let's hope that we can collectively, and in terms of resisting that, you know, from my books, and I've thought about this a lot, you know, we would need, you know, they don't listen to opinion polls. They don't listen to what people actually want. The only way to stop it happening, I think, would be for there to be a shutdown for the trade union movement to say we are not going to send our workers to work in the airports, to work in the docks, and for other workers in the public service to say we're on strike, we will not agree to this happening. And I think that's where the power of the international trade union movement exists. I don't know that we're anywhere near being getting that sort of on board characteristic of the international trade union movement going down to unions within countries. But I think that's the only way we could actually stop it from happening. What was the other one?
Yes, I think we might have another question here too, but oh no, we don't have another question, but the other one would just be, how can we deploy worldwide initiatives to build up peace?
Yeah, well, I think that's the importance of having organisations like the IPB and World Beyond War to coordinate across all countries to engage in activities that, you know, build awareness for starters, because we've got a media that's compliant with the establishment, and people are not getting the information they need to understand what's happening. And that is an area that we need to be engaged in. We are engaged in, but not effectively enough. There's a lot of work there to do on reaching people through both mainstream media and social media. So social media manipulation is powerful, and it's a big one for us to tackle.
Absolutely. Yes, we have another question here.
So I wanted to ask if you're getting any problems by the government that they try to get access to the population for information that they give you a hard time to make certain rallies or something. We experience here that there are very important topics that they try to just about cancel and to give us a very hard time to to make conferences about, for example, about Palestine or about they managed with the Ukraine war to bring a big part of the population on the side of the Ukrainians, leaving out the previous three before 2022. And but now with Israel, it is even more difficult for the government and for the Americans also to get the German population on their side. I wonder if you have similar experiences that they try to block you from bringing the different information across for people to show them that alliances with the Americans are a big danger for the country rather than a protection.
It's a good question, and it hasn't as yet happened in terms of us bringing people to Australia to speak at conferences, most recently. It has happened in the past, though. Where the government has got really aggressive is on demonstrations, particularly the environmental demonstrations where courageous people have blocked highways and so on, and they have brought in laws, draconian laws that can apply not only to the environmental activists but to anyone, any of us activists, as they choose to use it. Now the laws have been developed in the last couple of years, and you can be sent to jail for marching on a street where you haven't got a permit in certain circumstances. So it's it's happening. We haven't quite got as far as not allowing people to enter our country, as I know has happened in Germany recently over Palestine. Just on Palestine, we've had some really, really big. It's a big peace movement that's developed in Australia around Palestine. It's terrible that what's happened in Gaza has had to provoke this, but it's wonderful that we've seen so many young people come in their thousands to demonstrations all across Australia to support the Palestinians in Gaza, and the government really doesn't know what to do about it. There's quite significant Arabic populations in various electorates, so they're kind of having to, juggle their policies, and as a result, of this big movement, we have pushed the government to places they weren't going to go to, like advocating for a Palestine state.
I'm sorry, there was a short question.
Is it a follow-up question or a separate question?
Short other one. I understood, and I'm right, that your Green Party in Australia is a peace party. Which is very different from ours,
It's not a political party, it is an organisation. It's a network of organisations. Yeah.
Great. I think Stephanie hasn't asked a question yet, so I'll give her the floor first, and then I know Gaina has a question, and we have one online here as well. So maybe we collect the three again and present it to you if that's all right. Stephanie?
Wondering to what extent you've seen any inclination in the current government taking a departure from the previous Morrison government in terms of wanting to take a stronger stance and be a bit more independent. Is there any shift in this position at all?
Good question, yeah. The only shift that's happened to take a stance that isn't a rubber stamp from the United States has been over Palestine. Yeah. So we're very happy that there's been even that tiny little step away from just rubber stamping US policy. But other than that, no, Stephanie, no, we're all the way with the USA, unfortunately, on foreign policy.
That's an unfortunately catchy slogan, all the way with the USA. None of the way with the USA, maybe. Actually,
but let us positively see the progress by Palestine, including the three countries or three governments which now accept the Palestinian state. I think this is a big, big progress, and reduced these countries which are following Israel's lines. So, but my question is a little bit not directed to peace, but directly connected. What is the economic development of Australia? Because you all know that we have a decrease of industry and economy in Germany, tremendous expansion of the prices of energy, but what is the economic development of the capitalistic industry or capitalism in Australia?
it's deeply integrated. In fact, during the 80s, in the neo-colonial economic period, when the public institutions were privatized, American capital came in big time. For example, our Commonwealth Bank, which was owned by the people. I think it's something like 80% of the Australian Commonwealth Bank is owned by the United States. But there was a common perception that countries like China and India were buying into Australia, was kind of stimulating a bit of a xenophobic nerve in Australia about foreigners, and there was a lot of talk about this. But when one of our members did the research, and it's been backed up by other academics, the vast majority of foreign investment is from the United States and Britain. So, and also with the energy companies, they're getting away with just free rein to take all the profits out of the country. We're paying a lot more for gas in Australia. When most of our gas is exported, it's sold in places like Japan at a cheaper rate in Japan to what people in Australia can pay for their gas. So, yeah.
Just on that, Australia exports more gas than both the Saudis and Norway, and we make less money off it than both of the countries.
Yeah, it's just.
But you are exporting coal.
We continue to export coal, and the big one for to Germany, to China, to Japan. The big one is iron ore, and that has been our saviour, our exports particularly to China, of iron ore during the big expansion of Chinese economy over the last 20 years in particular. And it's enabled Australia to get through, like the GFC, when so many countries went into recession. Australia rode that out because of our exports to China. And it's ridiculous to think that we would want to make an enemy of the country that provides us with our greatest revenue. You've got to wonder about the intelligence of our leaders, really, don't you?
It's all very interesting, and I could definitely go with more questions, but I see there's one in the chat, so I'll go to that first. This is coming from Jenny Clegg, and she is saying that the situation in the South China Sea is arguably more dangerous than in the Taiwan Strait. Can you say anything about the Squad, the new links between the Quad? I think it is the Quad, right? Yeah. Australia, US, Japan, and the Philippines. Secondly, how do you counter the influence on the public of the idea of the China threat?
Okay, well, the Quad, in fact, is 4 countries: India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. That they form the Quad. India, the United States has been trying to get India to be more involved militarily in their quest to decrease the strength of China. I think some in America really just want to see China lose its financial and power capabilities and don't necessarily want to go to war. And you can see that through what they've been doing with sanctions on the chips and so on. But there's another component within the American establishment that is gung-ho for a military adventure, a disaster, if that was to happen. So I think the Quad was an attempt to bring in India into the fold. I don't know that it's actually working. I think India is really sort of very much hedging its bets and What was the other half of that question?
So first off, some clarifications from Jenny here. And I don't know too much about this, so maybe we're all learning something here. But so she's saying there's the squad which brings in the Philippines rather than India, I suppose. Australia has a new military agreement with the Philippines.
We do. We have formed a new military agreement, but it's nothing to do with the Quad.
It's cool.
She's calling it squad.
Yeah.
It's something separate, I
Yeah.
believe.
So Australia has established a command post themselves in Mindanao in the south of Philippines. Cora was the one who told us about that. We didn't hear anything about it in our media, but that is the case. And the overtures to the Philippines are frequent and strong. And just recently, Australian Navy has joined with the Philippine Navy to protect some of their islands, their coral atolls as well, and fishing grounds. And there's always the element of opportunities to provoke a response from the Chinese Navy in the near environment that they are operating in. The other provocation that's happened just recently is that Australian Navy, on the pretense of participating in UN, I can't remember the UN policy to contain North Korea, and they were supposedly involved in a UN mission, but it's been identified as a spying mission on China, hanging around the very edges of the area off the Chinese coast. So that's something we just recently put a media release out on, and it's getting a bit of airplay in Australia.
So the second half of that question, and perhaps then one other question here, but first, how can we counter the influence on the public of the idea that China is a threat that our governments are pushing?
Yeah, I mean, that is a challenge that we have, and we do spend a fair bit of time considering ways in which we can raise that awareness and engagement. And we have done many, webinars, and we speak at organisations' events. The big one really is to crack an effective social media capability, but also to crack mainstream media, getting our media releases responded to when we put them out, to have interviews on news programs, to get the issues and alternatives into the public ear and eye. So, that is the only way I think we can do it. I guess working through at the organisations that are our affiliates as well is another way to do that, and we have been working with the trade unions that are members to get articles in their journals to speak at their delegates meetings and their conferences. We have done all of that over the years, and we will continue to do that. It's quite intensive though, intensive work and time and effort to make all those sorts of things happen. And, we do need more very experienced people coming on board, like Stephanie when she comes back to Australia. So, that's the challenge. I think that we face wherever we are in this movement. In every country we're facing a capacity issue, and those experienced, capable people to be doing that interface between various organisations and institutions. I might just throw in the other positive thing that we have worked with is, and I mentioned this to you just recently, but we're working with the psychology, social sciences psychology unit at University of Queensland. The professor in charge of that there has just run a peace conference alongside our local peace group. She's also very interested in doing research that we can learn lessons from. like doing public polling and before and after. So she's got the resources to do that, and we're hoping that we will do more work with her to assist us in working out what campaigns are really going to produce outcomes that we want, and not to expend a lot of time and energy on doing things that actually don't achieve what we want.
Absolutely. Very important, and I think something we're all thinking about, especially with the change of times and digitalization, but also having these various connections, trade unions, universities, professors. You had mentioned before also the think tank of IPEN, and having these various groups. It's all very interesting, and I think it also answered. There was a question in the chat that can we stop these developments towards war with peaceful actions? Is it possible? And I think any other way would not work. But based on your response, I think we have plenty of tools in our peaceful actions kit to push this forward. Yeah. So just I think a clarification from Cora here. We have the visiting forces agreement with the Philippines, a joint project of U.S. and Australia building military facility at the U.S. base in Subic, 600 hectares military facility. The facility will be used by the U.S. and Australia and its allies in the region, including NATO forces. So that comes from Cora Fabros. We have another question.
I wanted to ask if you have any independent alternative media to channel your vision and your idea of peacemaking information, how important the relation to China is for Australia and things like that, and how the whole area is so dependent on China that they can't really risk to work against China without having dramatic economical setbacks.
Yeah, well, we should have an independent media that we can work with, the Australian Broadcasting Commission. Unfortunately, it's been wide-handed. They've lost so much funding over the years, and we struggle to have the opportunity to use the ABC as effectively as we could. We do work with some ABC journalists, doing with interviews, etc.
ABC means what?
So what's your equivalent here? It's the government broadcasting and television and radio.
Public.
Public. It is totally funded by the government, unlike the BBC, which is not funded by the government. Yeah.
And is the government influencing these channels?
It has a board that is supposed to be completely separate from the government, but the government of the day does appoint board members. So yeah, there is influence. Yeah.
Yes, here it's absolutely not. It's heavily governed.
Yeah. There's lots of independent media in radio, community radio, and a variety of news outlets that we have worked with and do work with. So where possible, we do utilise those links.
All right. Well, we are just about at our time here. So huge thank you to Annette for the incredible and really thorough presentation with so much information. We've learned so much from you, and online people are also thanking you for teaching them so much, for sharing so much information. I think this gives us all together a lot of motivation to work towards peace in our own context, but also on the international level, and making these connections like the Pacific Peace Network, IPB, World Beyond War, etc., to really ensure that these issues, which are so connected between all of our countries, that we're also fighting them together for a more peaceful future. I don't know if you have any closing words that you would like to share before we close the meeting, but
my only closing words would be the conference in Perth, October 4th to 6th. Please come. Put it in your diary and see if you can make it. Have a holiday in the southwest of Western Australia. It's a beautiful place. And it's a real honour to have had the opportunity to meet everybody here in Berlin. to be so welcomed and looked after. And again, a big thanks.
Thank you. And wishing everyone a wonderful evening or whatever time it is where you are for those online. And yeah, we'll see you another time. Thank you.